Reclaiming my time was never just a phrase, it was a rhythm, a cadence that turned procedure into performance. When Congresswoman Maxine Waters repeated those words in July 2017, the moment escaped the hearing room and entered popular culture. The clip traveled because it felt like defiance distilled into 3 syllables, a veteran lawmaker refusing to be talked over. Viewers didn't need to know the details of Treasury policy to understand the posture being taken. Power was being interrupted, and interruption itself became the message. The setting mattered as much as the words themselves. The House Financial Services Committee is not known for viral moments. Yet that day it became a stage. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin sat at the witness table, attempting to answer while the chairwoman cut him off with procedural precision. Each repetition of the phrase landed harder than the last, not because it was loud, but because it was controlled. The room stayed formal, but the internet heard rebellion. Within hours, the video fractured into memes, remixes, and loops. Gospel choirs layered harmonies over the clip. Social media accounts turned it into a slogan, and late-night hosts replayed it for laughs. To a growing online audience, Waters became a symbol of resistance, a lawmaker who knew the rules and used them unapologetically. Merchandise followed, book deals were discussed, and hashtags framed her as fearless. In that moment, she was not just a congresswoman, she was a character in a story people wanted to believe. The appeal of that story was simple and emotional. Here was someone who seemed to stand between ordinary people and a powerful administration, unafraid to assert control. The phrase sounded like accountability, like a line drawn against evasion and delay. Supporters saw confidence, clarity, and an almost theatrical command of the room. It felt like a victory that could be replayed whenever frustration with politics ran high. But politics has a long memory, and so does the camera. What becomes iconic can also become vulnerable, because repetition creates expectations. When a phrase is elevated into legend, it can be turned around with equal force. The same procedural language that once symbolized control can later expose its limits. In this dramatized account, that reversal arrives years later in the same room under very different circumstances. The calendar now reads February 14th, 2026. The location is unchanged. Rayburn House Office Building, room 2128, a space heavy with institutional gravity. High ceilings stretch above dark wood paneling, and the chandelier casts a steady glow that feels both ceremonial and unforgiving. This is the kind of room where careers are polished, tested, or quietly diminished. Every detail reminds those inside that history is always listening. The hearing title printed on the placards is deliberately dry. Government accountability and ethics in federal banking oversight sounds like a line designed to discourage casual viewers. It suggests technical testimony, dense language, and a predictable exchange of questions and answers. Waters sits with the familiarity of someone who has occupied this space for decades. Her posture signals experience, control, and an expectation that the day will follow a familiar script. The political landscape, however, has shifted. Republicans now hold the House, altering the balance of power without erasing the committee's influence. The Financial Services Committee still commands attention because money, regulation, and oversight always do. Waters remains a senior figure, respected for her tenure and known for her sharp tongue. She appears prepared to guide the hearing with practiced efficiency. Then the witness enters, and the rhythm subtly changes. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has requested to testify, framed publicly as an act of transparency and courtesy. It is an unusual sight, the chamber's most powerful Republican stepping into the witness role. He walks in calmly, wearing a navy suit and red tie, his demeanor controlled rather than theatrical. Nothing about his entrance suggests haste or uncertainty. What does draw attention is what he carries. Instead of a single binder or slim folder, he brings 3 banker's boxes. They are the kind used for archives, for records that accumulate over time. When he sets them down on the witness table, the sound echoes briefly through the room. It is not loud, but it is impossible to ignore. The gesture feels intentional, even symbolic. Before a word is spoken, the boxes suggest volume, history, and preparation. Cameras adjust, photographers lean forward, and a quiet curiosity ripples through the gallery. Waters offers a polite, camera-ready smile, the kind worn instinctively by seasoned politicians. At first glance, it appears to be another routine hearing. Johnson takes his seat without fanfare. He adjusts the microphone carefully, aligning it with the same precision he uses in his movements. His expression remains neutral, neither confrontational nor deferential. Observers might describe him as patient, even understated. The contrast with the dramatic reputation of the room's chair is noticeable. When he begins to speak, his tone is measured. He addresses Waters formally, using her title, and thanks the committee for the opportunity to appear. There is no opening flourish, no rhetorical warm-up designed for clips. Instead, his words move directly toward questions framed calmly and deliberately. The effect is subtle but disorienting. Waters' expression shifts almost imperceptibly. The expectation of control meets an unexpected posture from the witness. This is not a man waiting to be questioned, but one prepared to ask questions of his own. The atmosphere tightens, not with noise, but with anticipation. Those familiar with political theater sense that the script may not hold. Outside the room, viewers are not yet watching in large numbers. The hearing has not trended, and the title does not invite casual clicks. But inside, the dynamics are changing in ways that cameras are beginning to capture. A familiar phrase hovers in memory, associated with authority and interruption. Whether it will appear again, and in what form, remains to be seen. This opening moment is quiet, almost restrained. No accusations have been made, and no voices have been raised. Yet the presence of those boxes, the calm tone, and the reversal of roles signal something different. It feels less like a sparring match and more like the beginning of a narrative, one shaped by documents, memory, and questions that may not be easily dismissed. In politics, moments rarely announce their significance when they arrive. They often begin as routine, wrapped in procedural language and familiar rituals. Only later, in replay and reflection, do they reveal their weight. What follows in this account unfolds gradually, built not on spectacle alone, but on accumulation. The opening is not explosive, but it is deliberate, and deliberation can be its own form of power. The contrast between expectation and reality grows sharper as the room settles. Waters has spent decades navigating hearings like this, reading the tempo, anticipating interruptions, and steering conversations where she wants them to go. She understands how moments are manufactured, how pauses become sound bites, and how authority is asserted without ever raising a voice. For years, she has been one of the most recognizable figures on this committee, a fixture whose presence alone sets the tone. That history hangs in the air as the witness continues. Johnson's posture remains steady, almost disarmingly calm. He does not rush to frame himself as a victim or a crusader, and he does not attempt to charm the room. Instead, he speaks with the cadence of someone laying groundwork, sentence by sentence, careful not to overreach. His Louisiana accent softens the edges of his words without diluting their intent. It is the sound of patience rather than provocation. Around the dais, members of both parties exchange brief glances. Some lean forward, sensing that this testimony may not follow the usual arc. Others flip through their notes, uncertain whether they will need them yet. The gallery, filled with staffers, reporters, and invited guests, grows quieter. Even the photographers seem to slow their movements, waiting rather than firing continuously. In Washington, silence often signals calculation. It is the pause before a pivot, the moment when seasoned players reassess their assumptions. Waters' smile fades into a more neutral expression, professional and guarded. She adjusts her microphone slightly, a familiar gesture that suggests readiness to intervene if necessary. For now, she listens. The bankers' boxes sit untouched, their lids still closed. They are positioned carefully, stacked in a way that suggests order rather than chaos. Each box implies a chapter, a segment of history compressed into paper. Their presence alone reframes the hearing from an exchange of opinions into a presentation of records. It is a visual cue that something accumulated over time is about to be unpacked. Johnson references the purpose of the hearing, repeating the language printed on the placards. Accountability, ethics, oversight, words that are often invoked and just as often diluted by repetition. He speaks them plainly, without emphasis, as if allowing them to stand on their own. There is no attempt to redefine them or claim ownership over them. Instead, he positions them as a shared standard against which actions can be measured. For viewers unfamiliar with congressional dynamics, the moment might appear uneventful. There are no raised voices, no interruptions, no viral-ready confrontation. Yet, for those who have watched these rooms for years, the shift is unmistakable. The chair is listening, and the witness is not deferring. That alone alters the balance. Waters' reputation looms large in this context. She is known for her willingness to challenge witnesses directly, to cut through evasive answers. Supporters admire her for refusing to yield time when she believes it is being wasted. Critics see the same behavior as performative or heavy-handed. Either way, her style is familiar, and familiarity breeds expectation. Johnson's approach disrupts that expectation by refusing to engage on those terms. He does not bait, and he does not retreat. He speaks slowly enough that interruption would feel abrupt rather than justified. Each sentence appears constructed to stand alone, complete and difficult to dismiss. The effect is to make any procedural clash seem premature. The room's physical details become more noticeable as tension builds quietly. Light filters through high windows, catching the edges of polished wood and brass fixtures. The air conditioning hums softly, a constant reminder of the building's controlled environment. Every sound carries slightly farther than usual, as if the space itself is attentive. It is a setting designed to convey permanence, even as the people within it rotate over time. Waters glances briefly toward the gallery. She has always been aware of the audience beyond the dais, both inside the room and watching remotely. Public hearings are never truly private, and she has navigated that reality with skill for decades. Today, however, the attention feels different, less anticipatory and more evaluative. It is as though the room is waiting to see who will define the narrative. Johnson continues without raising his voice. He acknowledges Waters' tenure, referencing her years of service in a neutral, factual manner. There is no praise and no critique embedded in the acknowledgement. The statement lands simply as context. a reminder of how long she has been part of this institution. Longevity, in this framing, is neither virtue nor vice, just a fact. The absence of immediate confrontation creates its own unease. Political drama often relies on visible conflict, on moments that can be clipped and shared. Here, the drama is quieter, unfolding in tone rather than volume. It asks the audience to pay attention, to listen rather than react. That demand alone filters out casual engagement. For those who remember the 2017 moment, the contrast is striking. Then, the power dynamic was obvious, and the phrase, "reclaiming my time," provided an instant hook. Now, the hook is subtler, embedded in posture and preparation. The question is not who will speak louder, but whose framework will prevail. That distinction changes how the moment will be remembered. As Johnson speaks, he avoids personal language. He does not frame his remarks as grievances or accusations. Instead, he references process, documentation, and public record. The language is careful, almost clinical, stripped of overt emotion. It signals an intention to ground whatever follows in material rather than rhetoric. Waters remains composed, but the ease of earlier moments is gone. She nods occasionally, acknowledging points without endorsing them. Her hands rest on the desk, fingers lightly touching the edge of her notes. It is the posture of someone evaluating, not yet responding. Years of experience have taught her the value of waiting. The gallery mirrors that restraint. There are no audible reactions, no murmurs of approval or disapproval. Even reporters, accustomed to anticipating conflict, hold back. The atmosphere feels suspended, as if everyone senses that the opening act is still unfolding. Whatever this hearing becomes, it will not reveal itself all at once. Johnson finally gestures toward the boxes, though he does not open them yet. The motion is small, almost incidental, but it draws every eye. It suggests that the calm introduction is merely a prelude. The weight implied by those containers has not been lifted, literally or figuratively. For now, they remain closed, their contents only implied. This is how narratives shift, not with a single dramatic line, but with a series of deliberate choices. The decision to slow down, to frame rather than confront, to let silence do part of the work. In a space accustomed to procedural combat, restraint can feel unsettling. It forces everyone present to adjust their expectations. The opening phase of this hearing does exactly that. Outside the room, the broader audience has yet to tune in. There are no trending clips, no immediate headlines flashing across screens. But moments that endure often begin this way, understated and methodical. They rely on accumulation rather than shock. The opening is laying a foundation, not seeking applause. As the introduction draws to a close, the sense of inevitability grows. Something is coming, something grounded in the material signaled by those boxes. The room has been prepared, not through spectacle, but through pacing. Authority has not been asserted loudly, but it has been repositioned. The stage is set, and the opening act gives way to what follows. The shift becomes unmistakable once the questions truly begin. Johnson does not announce an attack or signal a dramatic turn, but the direction of the exchange quietly reverses. Instead of waiting to respond, he frames the conversation with inquiries that sound procedural on the surface. Each question is precise, built like a stepping stone rather than a leap. The effect is cumulative, encouraging the room to follow his logic rather than react to his tone. He references publicly available records, emphasizing that everything he mentions exists outside personal opinion. The language is careful, relying on phrases that suggest documentation rather than accusation. He speaks as though inviting the committee to examine material together, not as adversaries but as participants in oversight. Waters listens, her expression tightening slightly as the scope of his framing becomes clearer. This is not a single line of questioning, but an architecture being assembled in real time. The contrast between lived experience and representation enters the discussion gradually. Johnson speaks about the concept of districts, not as abstract maps, but as communities people inhabit daily. He asks questions that highlight proximity, presence, and familiarity, without asserting conclusions outright. The emphasis remains on what voters often expect from long-serving representatives. The room grows more attentive as the implications become harder to ignore. Visual aids appear, projected behind the witness table, chosen for clarity rather than drama. They juxtapose different environments, not with commentary but with silence. Numbers appear alongside images, offering context without narration. The strategy relies on the audience's ability to connect dots on its own. Silence, in this moment, becomes a form of commentary. Waters attempts to reassert procedural control, her voice firm but measured. She challenges the relevance of certain comparisons, framing them as distractions from policy oversight. Johnson responds without escalation, acknowledging the concern while returning to his stated purpose. He reiterates that oversight includes understanding how representation translates into outcomes. The exchange remains civil, but the tension is unmistakable. As the hearing progresses, references to family connections and campaign structures emerge. Johnson introduces these elements cautiously, emphasizing that they have been discussed in public reporting before. He avoids naming motives, focusing instead on the appearance of relationships and financial flows. The distinction between legality and perception is drawn repeatedly. It is a reminder that ethics hearings often revolve around trust as much as compliance. Waters responds with practiced explanations, citing approvals, advisory opinions, and established practices. Her answers are detailed, reflecting years of familiarity with these criticisms. She emphasizes legality, process, and precedent, drawing a clear boundary around what the law permits. Johnson listens without interruption, allowing her explanations to stand fully. The absence of immediate rebuttal gives her answers room, but also places them alongside unresolved questions. The hearing touches on historical events, including financial crises that reshaped public trust. Johnson frames these moments as stress tests for institutions and individuals alike. He references timelines, meetings, and outcomes without attaching explicit judgment. The implication is left open, inviting committee members to consider how proximity to power can complicate roles. The discussion remains grounded in records rather than rhetoric. At intervals, the gallery becomes more than a backdrop. Invited guests are acknowledged as representatives of broader constituencies. Their presence is referenced respectfully, without turning testimony into spectacle. Johnson speaks about listening as a component of representation, not as a performance, but as a practice. The idea lingers that voices outside the chamber matter, even when they are not speaking. Waters' responses grow shorter as the questions accumulate. She continues to assert her record of advocacy, pointing to legislation and public positions. Johnson does not dispute those claims directly, choosing instead to broaden the frame. He asks how success is measured over time, especially in districts facing persistent challenges. The question hangs unanswered, not because it lacks an answer, but because it resists simplification. Data becomes a recurring theme, introduced methodically. Statistics related to poverty, housing, and education appear, contextualized by timeframes. Johnson emphasizes trends rather than isolated snapshots, urging a longitudinal view. The numbers are not new, but their presentation alongside tenure creates friction. It is a friction that does not require commentary to be felt. Waters challenges the use of such data, citing systemic factors beyond individual control. She references broader economic forces, historical inequities, and federal limitations. Her arguments are familiar to anyone who has followed urban policy debates. Johnson acknowledges these complexities, agreeing that no single actor bears total responsibility. Then he returns to the question of accountability within those constraints. The dialogue shifts toward expectations placed on long-serving officials. Johnson frames longevity as both an asset and a responsibility. With time comes influence, and with influence comes scrutiny. He does not accuse, but he does not absolve either. The balance he strikes keeps the conversation focused rather than explosive. As the exchange continues, the phrase that once defined Waters' public image hovers unspoken. It is not invoked immediately, perhaps intentionally. Its absence is as notable as its potential presence. The room seems aware of it, waiting to see if it will surface. That shared awareness adds another layer of tension. When Waters eventually attempts to interrupt, the moment is restrained. She signals procedural rights without theatrics. Johnson pauses, acknowledges the interjection, and resumes after clarifying his point. The interaction feels inverted from past viral moments. Control is not seized, but negotiated. Throughout the main body of the hearing, tone remains measured. There are no raised voices, no dramatic accusations delivered for effect. Instead, the narrative unfolds through accumulation and contrast. Each segment builds upon the last, creating a sense of inevitability. It is less a confrontation than a sustained examination. Observers begin to recognize that the hearing is unlikely to produce a single clip that defines it. Its power lies in duration, in the way questions stack rather than explode. This is not designed for immediate consumption, but for reflection. The main body of the exchange resists simplification. It asks viewers to sit with discomfort rather than cheer for a winner. As the session approaches its later stages, fatigue becomes visible. Not exhaustion, but the weariness that comes from sustained focus. Waters remains composed, yet the ease of earlier confidence has faded. Johnson maintains his pace, neither accelerating nor slowing dramatically. The rhythm has been set, and it carries the hearing forward. The bankers' boxes are eventually opened, their contents referenced selectively. No single document is dramatized, and none is dismissed outright. Each is treated as part of a larger record rather than a smoking gun. The symbolism of accumulation proves more powerful than any single page. It reinforces the theme that oversight is about patterns, not moments. By the time the main body concludes, the room has changed. What began as a routine hearing now feels heavier, more reflective. Positions have not been shouted, but they have been clarified. Questions have not all been answered, but they have been placed on the record. The exchange has reshaped expectations without declaring a verdict. The longer the exchange continues, the more its character becomes clear. This is not a performance aimed at producing applause or outrage in real time. It is structured like a record being assembled piece by piece, in front of an audience that is expected to remember. Johnson's method relies on endurance, on the idea that sustained attention can be more disarming than confrontation. The hearing feels less like a debate and more like an inventory. As documents are referenced, the language remains deliberately restrained. Johnson avoids adjectives that would suggest judgment, choosing instead to let timelines and figures stand on their own. He repeats phrases like public record and documented history, reinforcing the source rather than the conclusion. This approach shifts the burden of interpretation onto listeners. They are invited to decide what the accumulation of information means. Waters responds with increasing emphasis on her legislative work. She lists bills sponsored, committees served, and causes championed over decades. Her voice carries the confidence of someone who has defended this record many times before. There is pride in the recounting, but also an undertone of defense. The distinction between intent and outcome begins to surface more clearly. Johnson does not dispute her claims of advocacy. Instead, he reframes the conversation around results measured over time. He asks how progress is evaluated when key indicators remain stubbornly unchanged or worsen. The question is posed gently, but it is persistent. It resists being answered by lists alone. At this point, the room's attention is fully engaged. Committee members who initially seemed detached now follow closely. Some jot notes, others simply watch, aware that this exchange will be referenced later. The absence of spectacle makes the substance harder to dismiss. There is nothing to laugh off or easily clip out of context. Johnson introduces the concept of representation as lived experience. He speaks about proximity not as a requirement, but as a lens. The idea is presented as a question rather than a standard. How does distance shape understanding, and how does understanding shape priorities? The phrasing invites reflection rather than resistance. Waters challenges the premise, arguing that effective representation does not require physical residence. She cites examples of lawmakers who serve districts different from where they live. Her argument is legally sound and historically grounded. Johnson concedes the legal point without hesitation. Then he returns to the ethical dimension, which operates beyond legality. The hearing's tone remains respectful, but the emotional undercurrent shifts. What began as professional exchange now carries personal weight, not because of insults or accusations, but because of implications. Long tenure becomes a mirror rather than a shield. The passage of time amplifies every question asked. As the discussion moves forward, references to past controversies are contextualized. Johnson is careful to frame them as episodes that have already been examined publicly. He avoids relitigating outcomes, focusing instead on patterns of perception. The distinction between clearance and confidence becomes central. Cleared actions can still leave unresolved doubts in the public mind. Waters pushes back, emphasizing that repeated scrutiny has produced no formal condemnation. She frames continued questioning as an attempt to recycle old narratives. Her frustration is controlled but visible. Johnson acknowledges the fatigue that comes with enduring long-term criticism. He then poses a broader question about public trust and renewal. The exchange reaches a point where silence becomes more frequent. Not awkward silence, but contemplative pauses where no one rushes to fill the space. These moments allow the weight of what has been said to settle. They also disrupt the usual rhythm of hearings, which often move quickly. Here, time feels stretched, almost deliberately. When Johnson references constituents, he does so abstractly. He avoids individual anecdotes, focusing instead on collective experience. The language remains inclusive rather than accusatory. He speaks about expectations placed on elected officials by those they serve. The framing emphasizes responsibility rather than blame. Waters' answers grow more guarded. She continues to assert her commitment, but the confidence of earlier responses is tempered. Years of service are invoked as evidence of dedication. Johnson listens without interruption, maintaining the hearing's measured tone. The absence of rebuttal keeps the focus on the unresolved questions. Observers begin to sense that the main body of the hearing is less about Waters alone. It feels like a broader meditation on power, longevity, and accountability. Her role becomes emblematic rather than singular. The questions posed could apply to any long-serving official. That universality makes the exchange harder to dismiss as personal. As time passes, the banker's boxes continue to symbolize accumulation. They represent not just documents, but years of decisions and consequences. Each reference adds another layer to the narrative being constructed. The method avoids shock in favor of gravity. It trusts that seriousness will carry its own force. The phrase that once dominated headlines remains unspoken, but its shadow is present. Everyone in the room remembers it, whether they acknowledge it or not. Its absence becomes a form of commentary. Control is not asserted through repetition this time. Instead, control emerges through patience and structure. Johnson's closing questions in the main body return to fundamentals. He asks about purpose, expectation, and the meaning of public service over decades. The questions are broad enough to resist easy answers. They invite introspection rather than defense. Waters responds, but her words now feel less definitive. By the end of this extended exchange, the room is subdued. No one appears eager to break the atmosphere with procedural maneuvering. The hearing has taken on a reflective quality. It feels as though a threshold has been crossed. Whatever comes next will build on what has already been established. The main body concludes without a dramatic flourish. There is no final accusation, no climactic interruption. Instead, there is a sense of record completed, at least in part. Questions remain open, deliberately so. The hearing moves forward, carrying the weight of what has been placed on the table. The room eventually empties, but the resonance of what unfolded there does not. Hearings end, transcripts are filed, and schedules move on. Yet certain exchanges linger longer than others. This one does not linger because of outrage or theatrical confrontation. It lingers because it refused to resolve itself cleanly. Ambiguity, when sustained carefully, has a way of staying with people. For those who followed the hearing in full, the experience feels cumulative rather than explosive. It rewards attention, asking viewers to remember sequences instead of moments. There is no single line that defines it, no phrase ready-made for looping clips. Instead, the meaning emerges gradually, shaped by pacing and restraint. In an era accustomed to instant judgment, that alone feels unusual. Public trust is a fragile thing, built slowly and lost unevenly. It does not collapse all at once, nor is it restored through a single performance. The hearing underscores how trust erodes through repetition and distance, not through one dramatic failure, but through patterns that accumulate quietly. That reality sits uncomfortably alongside the rituals of modern politics. Waters' supporters continue to emphasize context. They speak about structural inequality, historic disinvestment, and federal limitations. They remind audiences that representation operates within constraints imposed by broader systems. Those arguments remain valid and necessary parts of the conversation. No serious assessment of public service can ignore them. At the same time, critics focus on perception and accountability. They argue that leadership invites scrutiny precisely because of its influence. Longevity magnifies both accomplishments and shortcomings. In their view, unanswered questions carry weight regardless of intent. The hearing gives those concerns a quieter but firmer footing. What makes this conclusion notable is its refusal to tell the audience what to think. There is no closing argument designed to seal judgment. Instead, there is an open-ended reckoning that extends beyond the chamber. Viewers are left with impressions rather than instructions. That openness becomes part of the story itself. The phrase, "reclaiming my time," gains new texture in this context. Once it symbolized control through interruption. Here, time functions differently, as a measure rather than a weapon. It tracks years, trends, and unanswered questions. The shift from moment to duration alters the phrase's legacy. Politics often rewards those who master timing. Knowing when to speak, when to interrupt, and when to yield can define careers. This hearing suggests another dimension, the willingness to sit with discomfort. Allowing questions to remain open can be riskier than cutting them off, yet it can also invite deeper engagement. The end of the session does not bring catharsis. There is no applause that signals resolution, no outrage that burns itself out. Instead, there is a quieter aftermath, one defined by reflection. Such endings are less satisfying in the short term. They are also harder to dismiss. As days pass, commentary continues to unfold. Analysts dissect the hearing from multiple angles, some praising restraint, others criticizing its implications. The lack of a definitive conclusion fuels ongoing debate. Each side finds material to support its perspective. The hearing becomes a reference point, rather than a verdict. For long-serving officials everywhere, the exchange raises uncomfortable questions. How should decades in office be evaluated fairly? What balance should exist between systemic explanation and personal responsibility? How much distance is too much distance? These questions do not have simple answers. The hearing also illustrates how style shapes substance. Civility does not neutralize scrutiny, nor does aggression guarantee clarity. Restraint can sharpen focus rather than dull it. In this case, patience becomes a tool of examination. It alters the power dynamic without announcing itself. As the conclusion settles, one theme stands out. Accountability is not a moment, but a process. It unfolds over time, through records, questions, and public memory. No single hearing can resolve it fully, but each contributes to how it is understood. In the weeks that follow, the room returns to routine. Other witnesses testify. Other issues dominate headlines. Yet the questions raised here remain available for recall. They surface in debates, interviews, and future hearings. Their persistence becomes part of their impact. This ending does not close a chapter so much as underline it. It emphasizes that public service is judged not only by intention, but by outcome and perception. That judgment evolves, shaped by distance and reflection. It resists finality, much like democracy itself. The lack of closure is not a flaw, but a feature. For viewers willing to engage beyond slogans, the hearing offers a lesson. Moments matter, but so do years. Words resonate, but records endure. Interruption can assert power, but patience can expose complexity. Both leave marks, though of different kinds. As the story concludes, there is no simple takeaway. The hearing stands as a study in how narratives shift over time. It shows how authority can be challenged without spectacle. It reminds audiences that accountability is rarely tidy. And it leaves one final truth hanging in the air. Time, once reclaimed as a phrase, now reasserts itself as a measure. Not of who speaks loudest, but of what remains when the speaking stops. Not of interruption, but of endurance. In that measure, the hearing finds its lasting meaning.